I'm going to turn it over to AJ at this point, and he's going to talk about the model zoning ordinance, and I believe at another time we're going to come back and talk about the model permitting practices that we developed as well for solar. So I'm going to turn it over to AJ. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sharon, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad you're able to join us today. What I'm going to do is literally take you through the model. So we'll go provision by provision. I'm not going to read verbatim what's on the slides. It is a model, so it's very pointed in terms of the text. You have access to the information, so you can peruse through in detail at your leisure. But what I'm going to start off with is giving a little bit of kind of background context in terms of the model itself. A little bit of it is related to Zoning 101 in the way Pennsylvania, through the enabling a law in the MPC, the Municipalized Planning Code, allows communities to do regulations related to things like land use, accessory structures, etc. And then kind of what emerged is what was the appropriate approach for what we call solar PV installations. And you'll see that PV installation throughout a lot of these slides, and that's just a simple term for talking about solar systems, whether it's a ground mount system or a building mount system. In terms of the slide that's on the screen right now, the underpinnings of the ordinance, one of the early conclusions was there's probably 5 or 6 different ways that we found as we did a quick inventory of regulations throughout the Commonwealth or even nationally, how people regulated PV systems. And what we found in terms of Western Pennsylvania, or particularly Pennsylvania, was the way the MPC is regulated or allows communities to regulate. Solar systems really are not much different than a detached garage, a swimming pool, a satellite dish. Fundamentally, they're almost an accessory type of use. So with that kind of the back of our mind, we really started to drill in a little bit more detail, which is number 1 bullet. Virtually every ordinance in every community that does have a zoning ordinance does have some sort of regulation for accessory uses. And and again, Sharon had showed the previous slide, the 24 communities that we were working with. If you go back and you look at that list, it's a pretty varied list. There's very urban places, i.e. The city of Pittsburgh, and there's much more rural communities where agriculture is probably the predominant use. What we didn't want to do was try to design an ordinance for PV systems that was going to cause great upheaval in their ordinances. And because most communities already regulate accessory uses, we took the approach that the model needed to be an add-on. So it would be a chapter, a part, an article that would be added as a new addition, an appendage to their existing ordinance. And then number 2, that PV systems, from a pragmatic standpoint, it would be best to regulate them as an accessory use or as an accessory structure, akin to a swimming pool, to a satellite dish, to a detached garage. The other interesting thing that emerged is related to the fact that the 24 communities that we were working with directly were so varied, which is representative of not only Western Pennsylvania, but the Commonwealth as a whole. Was a one-size-fits-all approach wasn't going to work. What worked in an urban community wasn't necessarily going to work in a much more suburban or rural community. And hence, we needed to define provisions. While they followed the spirit of the model ordinance, they allowed communities to customize given their particular context. And I'll explain this in a little bit more detail as we get into the specific ordinance and the provisions, and you'll see where we have some optional language. But it gave communities an ability to be able to customize as they saw fit. And the 5th one was, this was kind of surprising, It really wasn't the issues that when we talk to communities, talk to code enforcement officers, zoning officers, elected officials, even residents. People really didn't have issues with a solar system, a PV installation itself. Their concern was more about, well, it depends upon the roof, whether it was a flat roof, a peaked roof, etc., in how that installation fit with the structure itself, whether it was on the ground or was literally mounted to the building or to the roof. That really was the issue. So you'll see many of the provisions are actually tied to the nature of the roof, which is a little unusual in terms of the zoning ordinance, because typically you don't hone into a specific architectural structure or feature, but in this case that seemed to be where consensus was, and that really was the hot topic. And then the last thing was another hot topic. From most people's perspectives, if a PV installation was in public view, the level of regulation, or the focus of the regulation, I think is probably a more appropriate way of saying it, the focus of the regulation was probably held to a higher bar than if it was visible from an alley, as an example. If the installation was occurring within the interior of a lot, there was less concern in terms of neighborhood impacts, adjoining property owner impacts, etc. In terms of the ordinance itself, the next series of slides, I'll literally take you through the provisions section by section. And again, won't read things in terms of verbatim, but really give you the essence, and then obviously you'll be able to input, submit questions, and we can get into any detailed responses in that. The first page, obviously, in any zoning ordinance, there's a preamble, which is describing really what the purpose or what the essence of the ordinance itself is. Again, this was a model, so it was designed for implementation not only in the 24, but other communities. We've actually had other communities outside the 24 that have taken the ordinance in terms of the model, have adapted it a little bit. Some of them have taken it literally as is and have adopted it since. They didn't participate through the detailed planning process, but have looked at it and said, hey, this is a good idea, this works very well for us, and have gone ahead and adopted it. But the preamble, in some cases, it could get modified. In the text that you see on the slide, you'll see bracketed words. Anytime there is a bracket, that is in everybody's ordinance is a little bit different. Some communities are municipalities, some are townships, some are boroughs. So anywhere you see a bracket text with italicized typeface, that is literally an example of the optional text that people need to customize. You'll see it when it happens with property, lot, parcel. You could go to 10 different ordinances and probably find 3 or 4 different ways people acknowledge a lot. So bracketed, italicized text is an example of the optional. And then there's another version of that we'll see a little bit later. This was just explaining in terms of the bracketed text. In terms of definitions, again, we took the approach back in the underpinnings of the ordinance. We wanted to have basically an ordinance that wasn't going to cause upheaval in your existing ordinance. Very few communities have really any regulations, any language whatsoever in their ordinance related to PV installations. So most ordinances don't even have definitions for terms. Any of the technology, any of the capital improvements that are related to the PV installation. So the very first section of the ordinance defines a whole series of definitions. Now, we did look through the 24 communities that we were working with to see what types of definitions that they did have. In some cases, somebody may have defined drip line somewhere. Obviously, that community didn't need to adopt our definition for drip line because they had already defined it. But most of the communities didn't have such a definition. But you see there's a whole gamut of definitions that really need to be addressed in an ordinance. A PV installation, well, I related this akin to a detached garage or to a swimming pool. There's a lot of things, a lot of terminology, a lot of scientific or engineering-based terms that people are not familiar with and really needed to be defined. So we did look, again, at some national examples as well as other common terms, for instance, impervious surface, and came up with what we thought was the most logical definitions that, again, could be adopted as a part of a model. Obviously, some of these could be tweaked on an individual-by-individual community basis. In terms of the specific purpose statement for the ordinance, and a couple key highlights in terms of the purpose, the first bullet, flexibility in satisfying on-site energy needs. And that's really what the essence of the whole Sunshot Solar Challenge was about. Was being able to allow households, residents to be able to defray costs by capturing the sun and being able to reduce dependency on fossil fuels or other energy sources in some form or fashion. Number two, it also allows communities as a whole to be able to reduce their energy demands. And one of the probably forgotten items that the Municipality Planning Code speaks to as a part of a community master plan or a comprehensive plan is a community's plan for energy. So many communities, just in the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years, are spending more time focusing on those aspects of a community master plan. And obviously, through the model ordinance, that now ripples into land use regulation as well. And then the last one was what many people were concerned about. How do PV installations fit in a neighborhood? Do they affect the neighbor? How do we mitigate those potential impacts? Applicability. In terms of the model ordinance, we are focusing on building-mounted and ground-mounted systems. So a PV installation that would be bolted to a rooftop would be bolted to, in some cases, there are some examples, to an accessory structure, or maybe in some cases to a vertical face of a wall. More difficult to do, but there are some instances where that occurs. And then a ground mount system, which is a freestanding structure in itself, typically on some sort of steel structure with a foundation into the ground. Completely detached, unattached to a structure, whether it's the principal structure on the lot or an accessory structure. Any PV systems that existed in a community prior to the adoption of the ordinance were exempt. So we did have to use a grandfather for that. And amazingly, and if you go back and look at some of Sharon's earlier slides, the map that had the dots on, does give an example of, we do have quite a few installations in western Pennsylvania. So there were places, there's some installations in the city of Pittsburgh that are almost 30 years old now. Obviously, technology is different. The issues at the time are different. So we did need to make an exemption for those existing systems. And then number three, any upgrade to an existing system that really materially alters the size or the placement of an existing system would now have to play by the new rules. So I think that's fairly customary in any zoning ordinance, whether it's a new construction or an expansion of a land use. We just followed along kind of the same line. Section 4 focuses on which zoning districts the PV installations are permitted in. In western Pennsylvania, and actually everybody, all 24 municipalities, this, from my recollection, wasn't even a discussion point. Everybody assumed that a PV installation should be permitted in every zoning district, and that's what we've accommodated. Now, it's not permitted as a principal use. It's permitted as an accessory use. and you see that under the text in number 1, on a lawfully created lot. So the position, back to the underpinnings of the ordinance, we didn't want to cause upheaval. We wanted this to be an add-on, and we clearly wanted to treat it as an accessory use. Accessory uses, to give it a little bit more background, why the approach with the accessory uses, it eliminates the burden of any conditional special approvals, additional costs. Ed had noted that in terms of his preamble in today's session, in terms of there are extra costs in some cases that have been occurred when people have tried to do PV installations. And literally in some communities, a public hearing for conditional use approval costs another $400. So the accessory use approach eliminates that. It also eliminates having to go to the zoning hearing board when it really fits within the fabric of development. And again, that eliminates some additional costs. Number 2, under Section 4, for building integrated systems, building integrated system would be solar shingles, as an example, or what they call very new technology, thin film PVs. So these are almost capture systems, energy capture systems that are made literally a part of the skin of the building, whether it's in a shingle or in glazing. And technology has reached a point where they're literally are transparent, what a building occupant would perceive as a transparent window that they're looking out of. On the exterior side, it's actually capturing UV energy. So this will continue to grow in the future. That really now fell outside of an add-on because it is so integral with the building. So the model ordinance treats building integrated systems as a separate animal and really kind of takes them out of play. That's more of a purely a code issue, not really a zoning, a land use type of issue. Section 5 focuses on where PV installations can occur within a lot. And again, you'll see that bracketed text up at with the italicized typeface, whether it's a lot, a parcel, a property, a tract, or whatever term people use. But for building-mounted systems are permitted to face any rear side or front yard in any unregulated yard area. So we're pretty much are saying anywhere within the defined setbacks or outside the interior of defined setbacks, a PV installation can occur. So the model ordinance does allow a solar array to face a street, to a public right-of-way. Completely permissible. It could be located in someone's backyard, invisible from really the public realm. In terms of ground-mounted systems, again, because we took the approach of accessory uses, accessory structures, is really that's what PV installations are. Many communities give some allowances with accessory uses and accessory structures. While they have setbacks defined for principal buildings, oftentimes they have a separate setback for an accessory structure, say a detached garage. They may allow them to actually encroach within that principal building setback. So if we were trying not to cause upheaval in existing ordinances, whatever their standard was for those accessory structure setbacks, we just said, on number 2 in Section 5, a ground mount system needs to stay within that same parameter. So we're literally treating them exactly the same as any other accessory use or accessory structure. Under Section 6, we start to define design and installation standards. Sharon didn't get into a lot of discussion in terms of the permitting and the relationship of oddly enough, not surprisingly actually, the MPC says one thing. When you get into a similar discussion, the UCC in one section says something, and then 200 pages later it says something a little bit different. The attorneys had to spend a lot of time kind of unraveling the legal side of this and what was the good path to take in terms of any of these regulations that that have been incorporated in the model. Clearly, solar PV systems and throughout this ordinance, through the model ordinance, need to comply with the UCC. And there are some discrepancies between language within the UCC, but we've found what we think is the proper approach that we can comply with. Even if there's a discrepancy, we can comply with all those standards. There's also, because the PV system has electricity involved, there needs to be compliance with NEC, the National Electrical Code. Under number 2, you'll see that subset of A, the bracketed text that's now bold. So this is the second set of options. So a community could opt to put this in their ordinance as it was, or amend it however they saw fit. We could not necessarily get consensus through the 24 municipalities that we were working with, specifically in terms of this language. But there was a lot of debate in terms of what to do with exterior electrical wiring, particularly for ground-mounted systems. Did it need to be buried in the ground? Did it need to be in conduit, etc.? Again, we have low voltages in some cases. Depending upon how big the array are, voltages become much more significant. So that was something each of the communities really needed to decide what they felt was the most appropriate in their community. If you were in an agricultural community and it was a farm that had a PV system, maybe they were using some power within a barn, maybe for milking operations, that type of thing, their approach would be a little bit different than, say, this was in a suburban community right outside of Pittsburgh. So this was an optional example. And the last one under the design and installation standards was the fire code. Right now, the Commonwealth has not adopted the most recent update to the fire code. So there's not a clear path. The fire code didn't necessarily at that time, the last adoption that Pennsylvania's gone through, clearly define how to handle PV systems. So if the Commonwealth would adopt a fire code in the future, the model ordinance basically allows that to take precedence in terms of any regulation. Could be related to setbacks from roof edges, etc. Oops. Went too farther. Setback requirements. In terms of ground mount systems, so we just had talked about the building mount system, ground mount systems, anywhere within the setbacks that accessory uses or structures are permitted. One key thing of this is at the bottom of the text. Some ground mount systems are on what they call a tracking system, i.e. the array, so the face, like where the bottom image, in terms of the picture, the array that's actually facing kind of where the solar orientation, the optimum solar orientation is, actually moves. So it's on a mechanical tracking system. The tracking system would also have to be within the setback, because in some cases these tracking systems, as the sun moves through the sky, it takes up a lot of space. It's a very expensive, that's not a common thing to see. But there are some systems that are out there. So the bottom portion of the text is the key thing. Height requirements. A lot of discussion through the course of the planning process and coming up with the language that made sense for everybody. Basically, when you read down through the text, for a building mount system on a sloped roof, and here's where the type of roof really kicks in terms of it matters. There's importance to this. If it was a sloped roof, what everybody had agreed, the top of the array itself, and turn my little pointer on, so the top of the array itself, right there, couldn't exceed the peak of the existing roof. So you couldn't have an array peaking above the peak. The second thing, in much more detail, was the dimension in terms of between the roof surface and the array itself. We controlled that at 18 inches. We had to work this out with installers as well as others in terms of what is a practical dimension. But when there was a roof system that was on a slope roof and it faced the street, it needed to be held to that standard. Now, if it was on the back of the house or back of the building, like in this sketch. So this was the street side. It had to be held to that same slope. If it was on the back side, its orientation could be a little bit different. The gradient could be different than the roof surface. It still could not jut above the peak of the roof itself. So that was where, on a slope roof, where people fell in terms of a specific standard. When it came to a flat roof, in the case of maybe a commercial building, so in a commercial district, we allowed a PV system, again, because they don't have a natural incline, they have to be tilted up so they get that optimum angle to capture as much energy as possible. We allowed 6 feet. So 6 feet for the array, so the bottom of the array to the top of the array, 6 feet above the roof surface. Now, in some cases, commercial buildings oftentimes are built lower than what's maybe permitted in a particular zoning district, and that's what the first graphic is showing. So that PV could be erected within that gray area. The maximum building height may be in that area in terms of the line itself. In the case of a taller building, there were some instances, and everybody seemed to have consensus, if it was a taller commercial building and they had already put their surface to the maximum, there was no reason that they shouldn't be allowed to have a PV system. So people took the approach, just as a steeple, just as a chimney is allowed to exceed in most ordinances the maximum building height, people took the same approach that a PV system should be allowed to exceed that up to 6 feet. So this graphic is showing that it now exceeds that maximum building height by no more than 6 feet. Another item in terms of related to height requirements is with ground mount systems. So the key thing in the ground mount system, and again following the same approach we've taken with almost everything, if there was a height established for an accessory structure, say a detached garage, whatever that maximum height was, that's what the PV ground mount system could go to. A lot of communities, 12, 15, maybe 18 feet is a common accessory structure height. That's as high as the ground mount system could get. Screening and visibility, a lot of discussion in terms of what was permitted, and again, depending upon if it was viewed from the public realm versus internally, people had different approaches. In some communities, in the city of Pittsburgh as an example, there's a lot of screening requirements related to HVAC equipment. In some cases, we really can't put a fence up immediately around a PV system and cast shade on it. Obviously, that would render it useless. So there needed to be some practicality in terms of how much screening. If a building had a parapet, and it would, obviously the parapet faced the street, the gray area, again 6 feet off the roof surface, defines where that kind of that PV system could be positioned. So a parapet does help do screening. If a building did not have a parapet, obviously its envelope got a little bit smaller. And a property owner, a business owner who's trying to do a solar install, they would have to be working with their installer to comply with the ordinance. This, again, section right here, when it didn't have a parapet, was what everybody decided should be optional text, because some communities, the screening had a different point of relevance than some other communities. So on section 9, the number 2 text, that was an optional section. Impervious surface, section 10. Obviously, the PV itself, being faced with glass or a cylinder material, is impervious. If the PV is located on a roof, it's already on an impervious surface, so this ordinance, the model ordinance, doesn't take jurisdiction of that. We're not double counting. In some communities count impervious surface as a part of lot coverage. Some communities have a separate calculation just for impervious surface, independent upon lot coverage. If it's a ground mount system, and again, to get consensus with the 24 communities, we did say that it was an impervious surface. I would be the first to admit There's no reason why you couldn't capture any rainwater that hits the face of it and put it into a rain garden or infiltrate it back into a lawn area. But for the size, the scale that we're talking about, typical residential PV system, maybe 400 to 500 square feet in area, that was a very minor thing. If the ground mount system was on a deck, was on asphalt paving, was already on gravel area, obviously then that surface was already counted as impervious surface to some degree, and we didn't want to allow a double count, so there's an exemption for that as a part of Section 10. 11, nonconformance. This was a major discussion point. We do allow a nonconforming structure or lot to have a PV system, as long as the PV system does not further aggravate the nonconformance. So, i.e., if a building was built over a setback, it had to stay in the shadow of that pre-existing setback. Signage. We didn't want to create a situation where we had the new Redmond tobacco on the barn roof in terms of advertising, that we would see Nike or Adidas advertisements in terms of those rooftops. There needs to be some level of signage, so we did give an allowance of 36 square inches, and that is for manufacturers, manufacturing plates, UL listings, etc. There does need to be a little bit of signage, but we didn't want it to become a new billboard. Performance requirements. Most ordinances have performance requirements related to glare, vibration, noise, etc. This gives allowances. This basically says stay within the same standards. There is no glare. That's a common misnomer. We heard that in some early meetings. PV systems are designed to absorb energy, not reflect the energy. So there really is no reflective light that comes off a PV system. There's really no moving parts, so there is no vibration. There is no real noise. There's a tiny little buzz if you're literally standing by the PV that you may be able to hear if it's live. But any performance standards that any community has defined, a PV system will be able to live within those standards easily. Inspection and safety, and these are just the last couple sections, and these were important. A lot of concern of what would happen if a PV system was abandoned down the road. So either somebody moved away, maybe the building was abandoned just outright, or in the case of the economy at the time where what it may have taken 4 or 6 months before to sell a house, sometimes that house is on the market for 18 to 24 months nowadays. So what happens with that? We follow the approach that is commonly used with an abandoned sign, with an abandoned cell tower, communication tower, radio tower, that type of thing, where the borough, the municipality, the township, always reserves the right to be able to enter the property if they feel that there is a fire code or building code issue. So there is a period there where the community is going to have to wait before they enter the property, but they'll be able to enter the property. And then in the course of, if something needs to be remedied, maybe the PV needs to be disconnected, maybe it needs to be literally dismantled and removed from the structure, or removed from the property itself, the municipality, the township, the borough can go ahead and do that. If they see fit, and they're able to recoup their costs. They're also able to lien the property. So again, this is a very common technique through other abandonment types of situations, akin to a sign, to a cell tower, etc. And then final thing, permit requirements. There is a permit, which we call the solar PV permit, for Western Pennsylvania, and that hopefully we'll cover in a future webinar. You would have to get, through the zoning ordinance, you have to get your zoning consistency letter or a zoning occupancy letter as an accessory use. But you would eventually need to get a solar PV to do the physical installation itself. And with that, There's a little bit of information. I apologize. The URL is cut off there. It goes onto two lines. If you go to www.pennfuture.org /sunshot, you'll be able to get more information. Literally, the model ordinance itself is there, and other information. There was a guidebook that was put together. And the guidebook takes you through the model ordinance, but it also gives you a lot of information related to how we came to conclusions that we came to, whether it was related to building code, whether it was related to the municipality's planning code. So a lot of the work that the attorneys had done through the process is really documented. We also had a lot of information related to kind of the frequently asked questions, or the factoids, in terms of people commonly ask questions and kind of the information that we were able to compile to answer those questions. So it's a great resource. Again, you can get that at www.pennfuture.org /sunshot. And last slide, I'll kick back over to Sharon. This is her favorite quote.
Thanks, AJ. Yeah, we always like to show this because this quote from Thomas Edison: "I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait till oil and coal run out before we tackle that." So even back in Thomas Edison's day,